The crimson dust of Xylos-7 clung to everything, a fine, pervasive whisper against the habitat's metallic shell. For weeks, my days had unwound in a meticulous, predictable rhythm: sample collection, atmospheric readings, the quiet hum of analysis equipment. I, Seth Raj, had come seeking silence, a canvas for the ancient tongues I hoped to unearth, though the official mandate was geological survey. This world, dismissed as resource poor, held a desolate beauty, a stark, unyielding truth etched into its ochre canyons. My solitude, once a balm, now felt like a tightening band. Today, the wind sang a particularly mournful tune, rattling the reinforced panels of the rover as I guided it across the fractured plains. My internal clock, usually an unassailable mechanism, felt sluggish. A weariness, deep and bone-aching, had settled into my frame these past few days, resisting all attempts at rest. I chalked it up to the planet's low-frequency magnetic fields, or perhaps the sheer monotony. My objective lay within a newly discovered geological fault line, a jagged tear in the planet's crust that promised unusual mineral compositions. The rover's sensors chirped, indicating a significant anomaly deeper within the chasm. I disembarked, the heavy suit of familiar second skin, and began the careful descent. The air, thin and metallic, pressed against my visor. It was not a mineral deposit. Its angles defied reason, shifting and reforming in my peripheral vision, a geometry that felt wrong, a violation of fundamental space. My scientific rigor, usually a shield, faltered. This was no natural formation. A low-frequency hum vibrated through the ground, rising into my suit's comms, a sound that resonated not in my ears, but in the very marrow of my bones. It felt ancient, a lament from before time. I knelt, gloved hand hovering, then brushing against the artifact. Etched into its impossible facets were glyphs, intricate and alien, unlike any linguistic construct I had ever catalogued. They did not flow like script, but rather seemed to exist simultaneously, each symbol a miniature, self-contained universe of meaning. An inexplicable shiver traced its way up my spine. I spent hours there, sketching, photographing, my rational mind grappling with something utterly irrational. The fatigue intensified, a leaden weight behind my eyes. I dismissed them as suit interference, a trick of the mind born of isolation. Back in my habitat, the artifact sat on my primary analysis table, its presence dominating the small space. I had carefully transported it, the heavy lifting a blur of focused effort. It continued its subtle thrum, a silent song that permeated the very walls of my temporary home. Every spare moment, every waking thought, now revolved around it. The glyphs called to me, a puzzle demanding resolution, an enigma that promised to unravel the very fabric of my understanding. My usual precise meal schedules blurred, replaced by an insatiable, obsessive need to study, to understand. I found myself pacing the linear storage section of my habitat, the narrow aisle lined with geological sample crates and excavation tools, the place I called my railway depot due to its sequential, organized nature. I ran my hand over the rough metal of a crate, my mind still on the artifact. Recalibrating. Dismissed, I muttered, my gaze already drifting back to the artifact. Environmental stress. Minor glitches are expected. Focus on the primary objective. My fingers traced the impossible lines of the artifact, a growing, unnatural connection forming between its ancient hum and the frantic beat of my own heart. I felt an undeniable pull, a terrifying certainty that within these alien symbols lay not just language, but an ultimate, unspeakable truth. And I, Seth Raj, was compelled to unlock it, no matter the cost. My fingers, still tracing the impossible lines of the artifact, felt less like my own and more like extensions of the ancient stone itself. The whispers, once a faint murmuration, had coalesced into a rhythmic cadence, a pulse that echoed the artifact's own, a terrible, intimate duet. I felt an undeniable pull, a terrifying surrender. Sleep became a fractured landscape, populated by geometries that defied Euclidean space. I would close my eyes and find myself not in the cramped confines of my research vessel, but adrift in an endless expanse of impossible angles, where light bent around corners that didn't exist, and shadows stretched into infinity. These were not dreams, not entirely. They bled into my waking hours, staining the edges of my vision. One moment, the familiar metallic sheen of my console; the next, the stark, echoing cavern of a vast railway depot, its gantries reaching into a perpetual twilight. The air in this phantom depot was thick with the ghost of coal dust and the metallic tang of forgotten industry. Rust-red girders formed a lattice overhead, and the tracks below, impossibly numerous, stretched into a vanishing point that pulsed with the artifact's low thrum. I saw no trains, no people, only the vast, indifferent architecture, an empty monument to transit, and I, Seth, stood alone in its impossible heart, the artifact still clutched in my hand. My understanding of the artifact's language was not a translation, but a brutal, psychic download. The symbols on its surface shifted, not into linguistic equivalents, but into ideas that burrowed directly into the deepest parts of my mind, bypassing logic, bypassing reason. I began to comprehend. Not merely see, but know. I knew of entities so vast, so ancient, that stars were but motes of dust in their wake, their existence so profoundly indifferent that the rise and fall of civilizations was less than a ripple on a placid pond. I grasped the terrifying truth of my own existence, a fragile, fleeting illusion, a brief spark against a backdrop of cosmic apathy. Humanity, my entire species, was a whisper in a hurricane that had no beginning and no end. My scientific rationality, once the bedrock of my being, crumbled like dry earth. My ship's AI, usually a steadfast companion, began to feel like a surveillance device, its calm, synthesized voice an insidious mockery. The readouts on my sensors, once precise and reassuring, now seemed to fluctuate with an unnatural rhythm, displaying data that contradicted itself, or worse, data that simply wasn't there. I found myself staring at the ship's internal cameras, convinced I saw fleeting blurs, impossible distortions in the corners of my vision. My memory became a sieve, moments slipping through its holes, replaced by phantom recollections of impossible places, like that sprawling railway depot that now appeared with alarming frequency, its vastness pressing in even when my eyes were open, even when I was awake. Was I truly on Xylos-7? Or was this entire vessel, this entire mission, merely another impossible angle in the artifact's geometry? The physical toll was severe. My hair was matted, my skin sallow. Insomnia had become a permanent resident, allowing only brief, terrifying forays into a dreamscape of shifting dimensions. Food became an afterthought, a mechanical necessity I often forgot. Then, the true horror unveiled itself. It was not a sudden flash, but a slow, creeping certainty that bloomed in the pit of my being. The artifact was not merely an object, a conduit, or a repository of ancient knowledge. It was alive. Not in any biological sense I understood, but with an alien, insidious vitality. It was not merely showing me truths, it was feeding on my perception, on my sanity, twisting my reality into its own grotesque reflection. It was a parasite, an anchor dropped into the deepest recesses of my mind, drawing sustenance from my eroding self, expanding its influence with every shuddering breath I took. It was not merely a thing I had discovered, it was a thing that had found me. A desperate, primal surge of defiance coursed through me. I had to sever it. I had to destroy it. My trembling hands reached for a heavy-duty cutting tool, its plasma blade humming with a familiar, reassuring energy, a sound that suddenly felt fragile against the artifact's deeper, more ancient thrum. I raised the tool, the intent to shatter the thing, to obliterate its impossible form, a frantic, desperate prayer forming on my lips. But as the plasma blade ignited, the artifact pulsed, not with light, but with an internal shift, a subtle change in its impossible geometry. A web of faint, luminous lines, like phosphorescent roots, seemed to extend from its surface, not into the air, but directly into my forearms, into my chest, into the very core of my being. The cutting tool clattered to the floor, forgotten. My muscles locked, my will subsumed. I stood there, rooted, the artifact humming in my grasp, and knew, with a certainty more profound than any scientific truth, that I was irrevocably bound. I was no longer Seth Raj, the xenolinguist. I was merely a part of its unfolding. The whispers, once a faint rustling at the edge of hearing, now surged like a tide of gravel, each grain a fragment of forgotten thought, an echo of consciousness stretched beyond breaking. The familiar confines of my research vessel began to undulate, not with the gentle sway of a ship in orbit, but with a visceral, sickening shift of substance. The metallic walls rippled, shedding their smooth sheen, growing coarse and pitted. Rivets popped and reformed, expanding into vast, corroded bolts that secured plates of ancient, sooty iron. The console, a nexus of blinking lights and data streams, dissolved into a skeletal framework of rusted steel, its former purpose forgotten, replaced by a sprawling, grimy expanse of track. I was no longer in the observation deck of the Stardust Seeker. I was in a railway depot. The air, once recycled and sterile, now carried the biting tang of ozone and damp earth, mingled with the metallic scent of old blood. Vast, arched ceilings, unseen moments before, stretched into a greasy haze, supported by colossal pillars of brick that wept dark, viscous moisture. The hum, no longer emanating solely from the artifact, vibrated through the very ground beneath my boots, a deep, resonant groan that promised colossal weight and ceaseless motion. My gaze, drawn by an irresistible force, settled back on the artifact. It pulsed, no longer faintly, but with a blinding internal light, a silent supernova unfolding within its impossible geometry. The symbols on its surface, once alien and indecipherable, now flowed into my mind like molten lead, searing pathways of understanding. I saw. I truly saw. The universe was not a grand design, nor a chaotic accident. It was a single, vast, indifferent eye, its lid half-closed, observing nothing. Civilizations bloomed and withered, not by divine will or cosmic fate, but by the whim of an unfelt breath, an exhale that scattered stars and snuffed out suns without a flicker of awareness. We were not even dust, we were the absence of dust. The universe was not malevolent, it was simply there, an eternal, unthinking entity that used beings like me as fleeting probes, temporary sensors to register its own unbearable, beautiful emptiness before being reabsorbed. My hands, once tracing the alien script, now felt elongated, jointless, the skin a dry, gray bark that cracked with every tremor. My breath, a rattling wheeze, no longer filled lungs, but an echoing cavity that vibrated with the artifact's ceaseless thrum. It was a train, but not of this world. Its carriages were not metal, but solidified thought, its engine a furnace of pure despair. It moved without sound, its passage a vibration that shook my very atoms. This was the true engine of existence, the vehicle of oblivion, and it was coming for me. A final, desperate surge of my original self, Seth Raj, flared within the overwhelming communion. I stumbled back, my transformed limbs awkward, heavy. The artifact, now a beacon of absolute truth, pulsed with a rhythm that demanded surrender. There was no escape. There had never been an escape. The railway depot, the tracks, the hum, the indifferent eye, they had always been here, waiting. My defiance was a meaningless ripple in an ocean of cosmic apathy. The train of solidified thought bore down, its presence dissolving the very air. I didn't feel fear, not truly. Only an immense, horrifying acceptance. My identity, my memories, my very essence, were being stretched thin, pulled into the vast, echoing space of the depot, becoming one with the rust, the grime, the ceaseless, silent thrum. It contained only static, punctuated by a deep, resonant hum that seemed to emanate from beyond the stars, and a single, recurring phrase, repeated endlessly, distorted and broken. The rails lead to nowhere or everywhere. I am the hum. Oblivion is freedom. The vessel was empty, its interior warped into an impossible geometry of rusted iron and phantom tracks, but the hum, they said, remained. It resonated from the very structure of the derelict ship, a silent, enduring message left for those who dared to listen, a prelude to the true, unspeakable nature of the cosmos.